Brock University acknowledges the land on which we gather as the traditional territory we continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is the home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Good morning and welcome to this session of Business Breeders, a live webinar series hosted by Goodman Group at Brock University. My name is Abdul Rahimi, and it's my pleasure to serve as the director of Goodman Group at Brock University. Goodman Group is a community-focused learning and development services provider that works to support professionals, businesses, and entrepreneurs pursuing growth through professional development, certificate programs, executive education, consulting services, and startup support. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's session as you take your break with us. This webinar series aims to provide 45-minute briefs that are led by our award-winning university at Brock University faculty, keeping us all feeling connected together. This webinar, in a moment, I'll hand the screen over today to today's webinar lead. That's Leela, who will lead today. We'll spend some time answering your questions. So thank you so very much. And you can do that using the group handle. And pleasure to introduce, serves as the inaugural Director of Human Rights and Equity at Brock University. She has spent her working life in the field of equity and inclusion, working at universities in Canada and the States. Her academic background is in social anthropology, with a specific focus on the transmission of culture across time and space. Her degrees are from McGill and University of Cambridge in the UK, and she has served as the chair of board of schools in the States and remains involved in the Niagara community today through her involvement at board levels of local organizations. Leela was born in England, moved to Niagara as a child, and then spent some time away in other areas, in other countries, but has returned to her roots in Niagara in 2018, taking her current position at Brock University. We're so glad to have you here today, Leela. Welcome to today's session.
Thank you so much, Abdul. I am excited to be presenting as a part of this series, and I look forward to our time together. I want to add very briefly to Abdul's land acknowledgement by speaking for myself as an immigrant settler and acknowledging that I live and work on land whose ongoing success was assured for centuries by Indigenous people who are stewards of what we now term ecological models, which is take what's needed and leave behind some for the coming generations, both two-legged and four-legged. You may be located on different lands across what we now call Canada and perhaps around the world, but I think daily about what it means to have reconciliation in this territory. And what does that mean about land? Brock is located on territory covered by the Dish with One Spoon and two-row wampum agreements. And part of my daily routine is to think about the universal relationships represented in these agreements around balance, harmony, peace, and respect. We also need to remember that colonization in Canada included the forced displacement of African peoples, enslaved in lands where they did not choose to be. During our short time together this morning, may we listen well with an open heart and a good mind. I've put some very basic learnings up on the screen. Part of this is to ensure that at the end you can tell anyone the differences between diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I hope that you'll take away some practical actions to move towards inclusion, assuming that that's your goal, And if you're looking to move beyond inclusion, I hope I'll also give you some possibilities for that as well. If we were together for longer, I would go through a series of ground rules. Because we won't have much time for interaction, I just thought I would mention a couple, as they might come in handy for any of you when you're having sessions where you're engaged in discussion of difficult topics. So a couple: listen respectively and actively without interrupting, without thinking about how you will counter an argument. Avoid blame and speculation. Allow everyone the chance to speak. And understand that when we're discussing these topics, all of us are bound to make mistakes. Have empathy for clumsiness. Clumsiness on the part of all of us. And an important part of today, but any discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, is making sure that we're ready to learn, unlearn, and relearn what we've been taught about these topics. Be ready to look at our world through different lenses. And because of that, I've given you a couple of suggestions of ways to acknowledge gracefully that we might be wrong on occasion. Oh, I didn't know that before. I will do some rethinking. Never thought of it that way. Thanks. Now I will. Simple statements of acknowledgement that we've learned something, which helps to reinforce it for ourselves. We've said aloud that we might be changing our minds. Given the nature of this particular session, I wanted to start by talking about the business case for diversity. Now, I want to be really clear that when I say the business case for diversity, that simply introducing structural diversity, so bringing in equity-deserving individuals into a workplace, does not automatically produce benefits. Taking a sort of add diversity and stir approach while business continues as usual is not going to spur leaps in your firm's effectiveness or financial performance. What matters is how a business takes that structural diversity and then starts to think about what changes will happen, which probably include some changes to power structures. If those things are all done, then companies see benefits. There is no doubt about that. I could show you page after page of statistics to prove this particular case. I'm not going to do that. It would make for a rather boring presentation, but it is important for you to know that if you want statistics, if in the setting you're in, that's what would be useful, there are plenty available. In this particular situation, I've looked at what if there were changes around sex. A lot of leadership roles are not held by women. What happens if we do? The Women's Forum for Economy and Society, working with McKinsey, found that companies in the top 25% for gender diversity were 21% more likely to outperform on profitability. So you can find, as I say, page after page of these statistics from reputable organizations, university statistics. So if you want any more about this, always feel free to reach out to me or do some searching for yourself. Another example of the business case comes from something very recent. Yesterday marked the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. In the aftermath of that, the Black North Initiative was founded in Canada, led by the Canadian Council of Business Leaders Against Anti-Black Racism. So the Black North Initiative is on a mission to end anti-Black systemic racism throughout all aspects of our lives by utilizing a business-first mindset. And they know if corporate Canada can boldly take on the challenge to add gender diversity to Canadian boardrooms and executive suites by declaring policies, setting specific targets, and holding itself accountable, it can do the same work to create better representation for Black Canadians. At this point in time, I think that over 400 Canadian companies totaling more than $1 trillion in value, including those in the public and private sector, major banks, insurance companies, law firms, government, and the largest asset managers and institutional investors, have signed on to the Black North Pledge. And I have listed on this slide the elements of that pledge. I'm not going to go through all of them given the time, but I want to make sure that you know what they have asked CEOs to sign on to. Implementing or expanding unconscious bias and anti-racism education, creating and sharing strategic inclusion and diversity plans with boards of directors and with Black North, work with members of the Black community, engage Canada's corporate governance framework, and creating the conditions for success. So not just taking the add diversity and stir approach, looking deeply into these issues, including by having what they state as complex and sometimes difficult conversations about anti-Black systemic racism and ensuring no barriers exist to prevent Black employees from advancing within the company. So if you're looking for some possibilities of moving forward, you can look to Black North and look through some of the information they have available, including what some of the various companies that have taken their pledge are doing. And lastly, when we think about the business case for diversity, there's a headline in the paper when this report was released. So the report is a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada, coming from the YWCA and the University of Toronto. And Canada's economy won't recover unless marginalized groups, women, are helped as well. So the statement as this report was presented, if we look at the impact from a health and economic standpoint, it is disproportionately on those with intersecting identities. You won't be able to have an economic recovery without paying attention to who is impacted and why, said Sarah Kaplan, who is lead on this particular report. So as we're thinking about COVID and coming out of lockdown and moving forward, we have to be thinking about what we need to do to moving forward. And it's become very clear that unless we take what this report is looking at, it's going to be much harder for us to move forward. As we're thinking about moving forward and we're looking at what can we do, what are some starting points for us, I'm going to ask you to concentrate on you. We can certainly, if I had more time, spend hours and days and weeks talking about strategic planning around equity, diversity, and inclusion. But prior to doing that, we have to think about who we are. As noted in the previous slide, we're all composed of intersecting identities, multiple identities for each of us. Depending on the time and location, different elements of our identity become more salient. So for each of the identities I'm going to mention, and I only have time to mention a few, think about the first time you learned about this particular identity and how often you think about it every day, every hour, every week? Does anything force you to think about it? I'm going to start with race. This is a moment in time when this identity is front and center, especially for Black, Indigenous, people of color in Canada at the moment. For us, living with racism is unfortunately a norm. But I want to be really clear that race itself is simply a classification system invented by humans in the 17th century. So we're living with a paradox where race is not biologically real, but is incredibly socially and politically real with very real life consequences, including death. The racial groupings that we've invented are actually genetically more similar to each other than they are different, meaning that there's no way to definitively separate people into races according to their biology, as was attempted to do in the map in the middle of the page. I've included some Canadian statistics on the left. These are from 2020, but they've only increased over the course of the pandemic, particularly with the rise in anti-Asian racism. 60% of Canadians feel racism is a serious problem in this country, up 13 points from 2019. 28% of Canadians say they've been victims of racism, up 5 points from 2019. 63% say they support Black Lives Matter movement. So at this point in Canadian history, we are recognizing that there is a problem around racism in this country. One of the things that we may say, often to try and communicate that we're not judging people by the color of their skin, is, I don't see color. And when that's said, and I recognize it may seem more logical if people become quote unquote colorblind, that our society would be more accepting. And maybe at some point that would be true, but we're not ready for that yet. For many people, their skin color matters very much, particularly because they're experiencing racism on perhaps a daily basis. To say, I don't see color, is to say that we don't see the racism that people are facing. What matters is people's own experience of being racialized. We need to recognize that inequities and systemic racism continue in Canada. Ethnicity, on the other hand, I want to talk about just because this is something that we do acquire or self-ascribe based on factors such as where we live or the culture we share with others. Ethnicity and race are also irrevocably intertwined, not just because someone's ascribed race may be part of their chosen ethnicity, but also because of other social factors. When people come to Canada, maybe they've never thought about race before. So someone travels from Africa, comes to Canada, and suddenly they're Black, rather than being Senegalese or Kenyan or Nigerian, or even from the region that they're from. So even with a chosen ethnicity, race is always lurking in the background. So take a moment, think about the first times you thought about race. Did somebody force you to do it because they called you names? That was my experience. When did you first think about ethnicity? Another forms of identity, sex, gender, gender expression, sexual orientation. So sex assigned at birth. Pretty obvious. I've given you, and I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with anyone who might be interested. This gives you a lot of definitions around these ideas and identities. Sex assigned at birth, basically based on genitalia. For me, what I want to make sure is that we understand that these are not new topics. We have not suddenly in the 21st century started talking about sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression. Perhaps we use different terminology, but these have been talked about for centuries. And in some countries, third gender, second spirit, two-spirit amongst indigenous people have been around since time immemorial. So when we are listening to conversations, for some of us, this may seem really new, but this has been a part of who we are for a very long time. However, the prejudices around sex, gender, gender expression, sexual orientation have not disappeared. Think about the messages that you received about each of these when you were a child, as you were growing up, now. Those messages may be very different depending on where you grew up and when. So another area in which we could have further discussion. Disability. Disabilities of varying types affect 25% of Canadians. People are sometimes surprised to hear that statistic, 1 in 4, because many of those disabilities are invisible. We are seeing people with disabilities all the time, but we don't know it. And the conversation is hampered because of ableism. Ableism is a belief system analogous to racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, that sees people with disabilities as being less worthy of respect and consideration, less able to contribute and participate in society, of less inherent value than others. Might be conscious, maybe unconscious, and often is embedded in institutions, systems, or the broader culture of a country. Often what we get, and this is why I've chosen this slide, is these attitudes look at disability as being an anomaly to normalcy, rather than an inherent and expected variation in the human condition. As we age, more and more of us develop disabilities if we don't have them already. We also have a medical model in place, which tends to look at the individual as being the problem rather than society, rather than looking at the societal barriers that make it very difficult for people with disabilities to be able to succeed. And it's something that if we're looking at our workplaces, if we're looking to become inclusive, that we have to have the conversations about why people don't disclose their disability if they don't have to. For some, it's impossible not to. For those who can hide, they will, because of the ableist attitudes that tend to permeate workplaces. When did you first start thinking about disability? What made you think about it? Thinking about cultural differences. So if we see culture as characteristics and knowledge of any particular group of people, could encompass language, religion, food, social habits, music, and art, shared patterns of behavior and interactions, understanding that it's learned through socialization. So a growth of group identity fostered by social patterns unique to that particular group. And we have many types of culture. We hear about corporate culture, we have microcultures, we have many different types. So as we interact with different cultures, we're running into those differing perspectives and stereotypes. What do we do? One way just to further demonstrate this particular idea is the iceberg. If we go with the fact that the majority of an iceberg, even these days, is below the water, we can look at the above the water. We have food, dress, music, drama. We have items that are on the surface, food and fiesta, things that we're looking at and absorbing. Below, we have deep culture. We have those unspoken rules. We have the unconscious rules that we learn as we're growing. We absorb them in our homes. If we live in a very homogeneous area, we absorb them in our schools, in our neighborhoods. If we live in a more heterogeneous area, we may learn one thing in our house, go out and see different ideas coming from our friends. We go home and we may describe those, and we may be met with delight from parents who want to know more. Or we might be met with, no, this is the way we think about those issues. So this deep culture is the site of many of these perceptions and stereotypes. And they're the foundation for our values, for the values that each of us hold. So you can just imagine thinking of those that you've absorbed from childhood. What happens when you meet those with very different values, but which aren't obvious? Again, they're below the surface. You're only going to get to them if you engage in conversation. So let's see how some of that can work. So let's think initially. One way is through cultural humility. And in fact, I think of this as one of the best ways of being able to move forward. Rather than thinking about different cultures displaying different characteristics and memorizing those characteristics, cultural humility is far more simple. It's that we reflect on ourselves, where we develop the messages that we hold, and we always treat other people as the expert on their own lives. Even where we may hold degrees, we may be somebody who is in a position of power. However, individuals, each of us clearly is the expert on our own life. And in doing that, we engage in conversation. We learn about who they are. We humble ourselves. And we're always learning and relearning. And if we move that up a step, we can move towards developing a notion of cultural safety in our particular workplace. For the most part in Canada, this has been used in healthcare systems, and mostly in Indigenous healthcare systems as well. But I think that we can think about cultural safety, think about being culturally humble in almost any workplace, if we choose to do so. I think we need to remember that I talked about structural diversity. In order to move forward, we need to remember diversity is a fact, inclusion's an act. We have to do something in order to be inclusive. It will not just happen by virtue of adding people who are from a variety of backgrounds. So you have to make a decision about what you are going to do about being inclusive. We have to understand equity. I've given 3 different samples here, all of which are quite small. But what it says is we can provide exactly the same thing to everybody. One box, the same bicycle, same height ladders. However, it will not help everybody to succeed. Won't be able to see the baseball game for free if that's your goal. Won't be able to bicycle. Won't be able to pick apples. We think about equity. We're providing what's needed for everybody to succeed. Multiple boxes, different types of bicycles, a taller ladder if that's what's needed. It becomes controversial because people may say, but why do they get the special bicycle? Why do they get 2 boxes and I don't get any? I know I don't need a box, but I would really like to have one just for the sake of it. So we have to be ready to talk about what it takes for everybody to succeed. We have to remember that we judge ourselves by our intentions. We're good people. We are not trying to hurt others. However, people we're speaking to judge us by our impact. As you know, that was really horrible. Often our immediate reaction is, but I didn't mean it that way, because we're good people. We didn't mean it that way. However, we go back to thinking about learning, unlearning, relearning. It's a moment to be able to say, I just didn't think about it like that. I am so sorry. We have to think about bias as we move forward. It's no good to say, I'm not biased. I'm not biased. I view things objectively. We do try, but we're human beings. Bias exists in all of us. And so we have to think about how bias is playing out. How is it playing out for all of us? And what can we do about it? And in that regard, I want us to be able to think about bias. I don't have time to cover 20 or 50 types of bias, so I've just selected 2 and hope people will investigate more types of bias that may influence them. In-group bias. The person at the top is saying, I don't know what it is, but I have a good feeling about the person in the blue shirt. I trust her. She knows what's up. I can tell. She's not trusting the person in the green t-shirt. Now, we're looking at them. She's wearing a t-shirt with a cat on it, or a tiger, a cat. And the woman in blue is wearing a cat. Woman in green is wearing a dog. Now, simplistic example, I agree. But we automatically categorize people and make these assumptions as to who we're going to get along with better without thinking about it. This is the thing. We're not consciously thinking about it. We just make that decision and form our groupings really quickly. Stereotypes. Mentioned the word several times. Type of bias. We have a shared idea about attributes of others with respect to perceived physical, cultural characteristics. Often we're filling in blanks. We've not actually met somebody from that particular group. We're filling it in with what we've heard from our family, from the media, from school, wherever it may be. We make generalizations about that group. Occasionally there's stereotypes that seem positive, but they tend to have negative consequences. And when people are judged according to these perceived norms of their group instead of personal merit, it can affect everything that we're doing. In the workplace, it can affect who we're hiring, who we're retaining, who we're promoting, if we are thinking about the ways in which biases play out. From stereotypes to in-group bias to all the other types of cognitive biases that come into play. So We've got some basic foundation. So now we think about other strategies. What are we going to do now we're thinking about all those things? We can slow down. We can think about ways in which we're being swayed by bias. This chart from a group that looks at bias in media sort of gives us some pathways to slow down, to ask some questions, to think about our personal take on something. Why was that my immediate thought? Let me think through that. Oh, maybe it was because of this. So taking time, and one of the things that we know is we recognize bias in other people quicker than we do in ourselves. So if we're in a group setting, have a conversation about the fact that we may call others out on biases that we see, because we all have them. It's not as if by calling someone out, you're putting yourself in some superior position, because they could be calling you out the next moment. Thinking about reframing, confronting bias. When you're about to say something to someone, like, oh, I don't know if I should do that, because then it's going to create, the group's going to split up, and I just don't know what to do. But when you do it, and it is something that takes practice, then you're creating a space where everyone's valued and able to contribute their best and moving the workplace forward. But we have to be able to speak up and say, I'm not sure about that. I'm thinking, for me, I realized there was probably some bias there when I made that decision. What can we do as individuals to think about bias? Question our assumptions. Start with us. Why am I thinking that way? Would I be drawing the same conclusions if the individual was this, that, or the other? Analyze. Ask ourselves about if the forms of bias that we are experiencing are consistent with our personal values, consistent with what our workplace is doing. If they're not, how can we change? Take risks. Put yourself outside your comfort zone. Disrupt the default. Challenge elements of the status quo that maintain biases. Speak out. Discuss issues in a way that are comfortable to you. Practice ahead of time in a situation where you're not having to speak out. What will you say when you hear a biased statement coming out of somebody's mouth on a search committee? Hold yourself and others accountable for self-reflection, for learning, relearning, analyzing behaviors, and what you're going to do about it. I think that it's really important, as we think about ideas around cultural humility, to remember this: to treat others as they want to be treated. Not as we want to be treated, but as they want to be treated. And to do that, you really have to employ cultural humility. They are the experts on their own lives. You have to talk to them to find out how do they want to be treated? What will make sure that they are retained in your workplace? Thinking about how you say something. Somebody makes a comment. There's many ways that you could interrupt and disrupt the conversation, but I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say, oh, I'm really glad I misunderstood you, because such comments can be very seen as racist, sexist, homophobic. I need you to help me understand what you meant by that, or why you said that. When I heard that comment, I just feel like I don't belong here. Can we meet and talk about this further? And maybe that last one is because the comment wasn't made to you. It was made to somebody else. But you're going to step in and have a conversation. And when you do that, let the person who felt it or it was aimed at, let them know that you did something. They know there's an ally in their workplace. So take 2 actions. Say something to the person who said it, and say something to the person who was affected by it. Show your support. Putting cultural safety into action, similar things. Do something. Being well-intentioned is definitely not enough. Take responsibility for your own learning. Reflect on you, on your own assumptions and biases. Commit to lifelong learning. Prepare to be uncomfortable, perhaps the rest of your life. And a final strategy, think about the danger of hearing a single story. If you haven't heard the incredible TED Talk that goes called The Danger of a Single Story, it's a great use of 17 minutes. And what we hear in that is the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So, having listened to a very brief conversation about equity, diversity, and inclusion, is there anything you'll do differently? I hope so, although I hope what you take away is that this is lifelong work and cannot be resolved simply by adding and shaking and guessing a different product. I hope you think about who you are and how your identities and culture impact your daily lives. As I said, I'm not going to pretend that a workplace where all belong won't require work. Encourage a culture where all will succeed, opinions are valued, and everybody can see themselves represented in company leadership. I'll leave you with a couple of challenges. 1, move beyond the single story. And 2, choose something from what I said and practice it for the next little while, and then come back and ask for some deeper strategies. Thank you.
Leela, thank you so very much. Ever so insightful. And you also provided some real strategies that could be taken away and applied. We do have a few questions, but just cognizant of time, we may not be able to go through all of them. So we'll do most to answer as much of it as possible. So the question here for you is that we have received: how is EDI measured typically? And then, in your opinion, how should it be measured?
Often it's measured by structural diversity, by numbers. Who do we have in place? And it's not that that's not important. And having data is very helpful. So you can disaggregate the data and you can look at who is where, who is coming in the door, how long are they being retained, who's being promoted, who's not being promoted, who's leaving. And you can use that data to be able to look at the stories of the people who are in an organization. But then you also need to get some qualitative data to run alongside it. The stories of those who left and the stories of those who may be considering leaving, and the stories of those who stayed. What's working? So I think those would be the quick way of looking at that.
Great. And briefly, if you might, how does EDI affect BIPOC women in white spaces of academia in terms of positive career advancement or lack thereof? And you did spoke to some strategies, but if there are maybe some specific ones that you could speak to here, and then finishing off around this in terms of the hopeful messaging around it for the future.
I think EDI, each of those elements has a different impact on BIPOC women all together. I mean, diversity tends to bring us in the door, but what happens after that is dependent on the place, the culture of the place. And often it might not be a happy story. It's easy to list forms of exclusion, actually, but we do have to look, that's the hope of looking to what has worked. And I would say that we're often left to make our own strategies, which isn't bad because they're tailor-made by us. I hope that we are developing true allies, those who can speak up and say, stop, we have to think about this. And I do think that there's more allies around. I was reading a piece the other day which said we have to have our circles of support, which may be people in our workplace, but maybe they're not. And we have to be able to turn to them and be ourselves. The other thing is to think about how we can create that. I'm in a group of BIPOC women and non-binary people who in the academy, and it's a very supportive place for people to vent, which I think is necessary, but it also allows people to practice some of the tactics. And one of those tactics is being able to say no, being able to say no to being the go-to person for every committee, every EDI commitment. And how do you do that when you feel that your job is at risk? And that's where allies come in. So obviously we could talk about that for hours, but quickly, that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you again so very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule and for being here and for speaking to our audience. Much appreciated on this very, very important topic as well. It's a pleasure. Thank you. And then on the slide that's coming up on the screen, so Goodman Group is a community-focused learning and development services provider that works to support professionals, businesses, and entrepreneurs pursuing growth through professional development, certificate programs, and executive education, as well as consulting services and startup support. So I'm pleased to share with you that Goodman Group's latest professional development offering is a program in the area of data-driven decision-making, and it is open for registration now. The data-driven decision-making series focuses on effective decision-making and how businesses and institutions can be complemented to enhance the key aspects of business analytics when data science with the intuitive components of decision and decision-making. The series is ideally suited for professionals who are looking to enhance their decision-making skills through the power of data. Taking advantage of the alumni and multiple seminar discounts, as well as your group discounts, please reach out to the Goodman Group team to book your virtual seat at your earliest convenience. There are also information available on funding as well as information about how to register. Well, that is all that we have time for this session of Business Breeders. And thank you for all of you for staying patient and through this session. And joining us next session is Ken Chan and guests who will be talking about employee wellness and corporate social responsibilities in the COVID era. And that is in 2 weeks' time, our first one in June. Until then, stay safe, and I hope to see many of you then. Thank you.